Thanks, Michelle. I'm not so used to the fancy gadgetry and everything else, but before I got going, I just wanted to say thank you to Michelle for having the courage, faith, and everything else to set this up today. It was an honor and a privilege that she asked me to talk today, so thank you for that. More than that, I think that Barry spoke so great about setting up our profession and why it's important. And some of the speakers later today, Ali Perez and his testimony, I'm really looking forward to hearing. And then that our other chaplain guy, I always forget his name. It's like Shooter or Bomber or something. I can never remember. But, you know, he's a Navy SEAL. And I'm not going to steal all his thunder, but I don't know how I can kind of compete with the Navy SEAL stories. I mean, you know, jumping out of airplanes in places that he can't talk about and super secret squirrel stuff. I don't know how I can quite talk about that. So Michelle, thank you so much for allowing me to go before those guys. The check will be in the mail on that here pretty soon. So I'm going to talk about my story. Something that's happened in my life. And it's not as much about the thing that happened as what's happened after. A number of you know my story, but a few years ago on a Friday night, I lost my wife. And since then, I've gotten remarried. My lovely, beautiful wife, Cindy, is here today, and she loves the Lord, and she loves me almost as much as Roger Federer. But he lost the U.S. Open a couple weeks ago, and so I've edged up a little bit on that. So I'm thankful for that. So I was appreciative of Roger. A Friday evening a few years ago, I was at home with Daisy and Gage, who are my kids. They were 3 and 4 at the time. And we were messing around the farm. We have a little blueberry farm up in Temecula. It's a family farm, and we live on one end of the farm, and my folks, who the kids refer to as Nana and Papa, live on the other end of the farm, and they live upstairs in a little red barn. And my wife, Shelley, was coming home from school. She was an assistant principal at a middle school in Temecula. And she was coming home, and I knew she only had just a little bit of time, half an hour, 45 minutes to stay at home. She was heading back to a basketball game for one of the girls that she was mentoring. And the girl was in 8th grade, and in 6th grade, she was off the track. And I think in law enforcement, we know what somebody who's off the track means. And by 8th grade, man, she was doing a lot better. So she had to head back to that basketball game just to kind of support her. And a few months before, she had ordered a tractor. And it was a 1956 Cub Cadet tractor. And it was tiny. So picture like a lawnmower, garden-type tractor, tiny. It weighed about 650 pounds. And she got it to fix up and eventually give to the kids. And it was tiny. I mean, tiny, ride-on lawnmower type tractor. Well, she'd got that, and she organized a mechanic to come out and work on it and work on a carburetor. And I don't even know what a carburetor is today with, you know, fuel injection. He worked on the carburetor and did some wiring and changed the oil and changed the tires and did some wiring stuff and got it all put back together and everything else. And so I drove it around, and on that Friday, the mechanic was there. It's all fixed up. It's ready to go. So she gets home, and I'm playing around with the kids, and we're getting ready for blueberry season. The plants are pretty tall at that time of the year, and she wants to drive it. And so I said, sure. So I hop on and show her this and show her that, and she's off and driving. And you can't quite see past each row. You can look up and down the row, but you can't quite see what's on the other side of the row because the plants are pretty tall. So she's driving up and down the rows and driving around the barn. So I take the kids upstairs to Nana and Papa's house, and we're going to have dinner there while she goes off to the basketball game. So we get upstairs, and while we're upstairs, I'm looking out, and I don't see her driving around, and I see a little white tire, and it's about this big, and the tire's pointing up to the sky. And I'm like, that seems odd. So I'm looking closer, and I see a yellow and orangish cowling, and that's what color the little tractor was, right next to the tire. And I don't know what it was, but instantly I knew that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, so I told my folks, hey, keep Daisy engaged here, and I ran downstairs and jumped in my pickup and drove down to the end of the driveway right before it goes up the hill. Parked real quick and jumped out, and I saw the tractor was tipped over on its side, and it had Shelly's leg pinned underneath it. And I jumped out, ran over. I don't know how I picked that tractor up. I don't know how that happened. It was heavy, but somehow got it off her and instantly kind of went into cop mode. I knew what had to be done, and I started doing it. There's not a thought. There wasn't time to work up into anything else. And so I jumped on the phone real fast, hit 911 send. That send is really important. Put it on speaker and threw the phone on the ground and started CPR. And I didn't find a pulse, and Shelly definitely wasn't breathing at that time, but I'm starting CPR. Meanwhile, certainly talking to the Lord, probably saying the exact same things that one of you would say in that same situation. And while talking to the dispatcher on the phone, we hung up after a couple minutes, and I'm in CPR. I hear the sound of a Crown Vic, and we all know the sound of a police car when the engine's wound up and it's coming down the road. You can hear it, especially at night, from a mile away. And I hear the sound of the Crown Vic coming down, and a car comes down the road real fast, and the deputy jumps out, and he runs up and he says, how can I help? And I tell him, hey, you can do chest compressions. And at that time, he knew that I was a cop. He knew that I was in law enforcement. He jumped in and he started doing chest compressions, and I'm doing breaths. And we continued out a few minutes. Meanwhile, my dad's seen cop cars driving down the hill, and he comes over and finds out what's going on. And he was a fireman, so I think he jumped in there a little bit. And pretty soon the fire engine drove down the road, and the paramedics and everything else, all law enforcement's showing up. And the firemen got out and walked over casually like firemen typically do. They walked over, and I'm there with some kind of expectation that they're going to hook Shelly up, and they're going to, put whatever defib, ventilator, whatever they're going to do. None of that happens. They check her, they check a pulse and anything else, and they pronounce her right then. I stood up, and I'm a little bit in shock. This isn't something that you wake up in the morning thinking about doing CPR on your wife that evening. And our neighbor, Mike, he was retired from the military, and he was deployed a whole lot and saw a lot of death. And Mike came up and grabbed me, kind of that position of control hold, whatever, grabbed me by the back of the arm and said, hey, we're out of here. The kids are at home, and they need you. So we walked back to the house, and that deputy that showed up, his name's Chris, and him and I have stayed in contact since then. And Chris, I think later comes to find out he was kind of assigned to shadow me kind of throughout the evening. And a half an hour later, Chris is standing in the downstairs part of the folks' barn, and he's crying. And everybody in the room that's a cop, we've seen plenty of death. We get it. And I think at times our hearts get a little bit hardened to somebody else's death. But I saw he was crying, and that was a little bit unusual, I noticed. And he looked over at me, and he put his hand up on my shoulder. And he said, Mike, he said, 6 years ago, I was talking to my wife. She called me while I was on the phone, and he said she had a heart attack while I was talking to her on the phone, and she died while I was on the phone. And he says, I don't understand everything you're going through right now, but he said, it will get better. It just takes time, and your heart will heal. It just takes time to get there. And since then, Chris, he's a believer now. He's a follower of the Lord. I don't think he was at the time. He attends the same church that I attended for 17 years. Cindy's dad's a pastor of a church, and I didn't know it at the time, but when you marry a PK or a pastor's kid, there's fine print down on the bottom that says, "Thou shallest attendest that churcheth." So anyway, I know that now. So, but Chris, they're standing in front of me saying that, hey, your heart will heal. It just takes time. I saw hope right there in front of me, and I could follow a little rabbit right now and go down a different trail and say that I don't think that it was any coincidence how that deputy in all of Riverside County of a force of 3,500 cops, I don't think it was a coincidence that that deputy showed up that day. But that's another one. So I'm back at home, and one thing that I couldn't really allow, my phone's starting to blow up. And I'm not answering any calls. I answered 2 calls that night. My phone's blowing up, and I couldn't allow myself to be comforted. And this isn't any scriptural thing. I just couldn't allow myself to be comforted until I did 2 things. One is tell Shelly's parents, hey, of what happened. And the second was telling the kids. How do you tell a 3 and 4-year-old that their mommy's died? I don't know how you do that. The 2 calls I did answer that night, one was from Shelly's sister Tammy, who lived in Temecula, who actually had kids that went to her school. She called, and I answered, and she says, Mike, tell me it's not the case that I learned about Shelly's death on Facebook. And I don't know really what to say. One of the firemen had an 11-year-old son, and when he got done with the call, he called his 11-year-old son. And what does any good 11-year-old do but jump back in Facebook? Hey, by the way, send it out to 400 of his closest friends. Shelly Graesser's died. So that was fairly special. I think that us in emergency services have somewhat of an obligation to keep stuff quiet for a bit. But that another aside on that. The other call I received that night was from somebody that I worked with. It was the only call that I accepted from work, and there was kind of 2 parts to the call. One part's always that uncomfortable thing when it comes to cops getting fired, a big tragedy happened, they get caught doing something, they get arrested, is the fact that they're wearing a gun. And I don't think that population in general gets that. But man, when you're going to fire a cop, there's always that thing in the back of your mind going, this could go really, really bad. Or, they get arrested. There's that gun thing there. And so I knew what he was alluding to, that I might hurt myself. And so I wanted to spit that out really quick. And I said, hey, look, I have an obligation. I've got a 3 and a 4-year-old at home, and they need their daddy. And I will never do anything stupid to harm myself. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and a little bit of peace. The second part of that conversation was Shelly had been dead for about an hour and a half or 2 hours. Next thing you know, I'm getting a little mini sermon in God's sovereignty. And you just got to trust God, and he's going to work this all out, and it'll be okay, and God's in control. And I didn't respond at that moment, but that stuck with me. So I went home and got the kids' PJs and got them ready for bed, and I realized I got to go call Shelly's folks. So I had to walk away to do that because I knew that was going to be a pretty emotional conversation. So I walked a couple 100 yards away from the farm and sat down on a rock and called Shelly's dad, whose name's Don. And I called Don, and they live up in Idaho, and he knew that something was wrong right when he picked up the phone. I told him what happened, and that call right there has been absolutely the second hardest thing that I've done in my life. How do you tell a father that their daughter is no longer here? And so I went through that with Don, and I'm crying and he's crying, and before he got off the phone, he says, Michael, I've got to drive over to tell Shelly's mom, Nancy. She's in McCall, Idaho. They live up in Idaho, and it's about a 2.5 hour drive, so I better get going. But before he got off the phone, he said, Michael, I love you. And I love those kids. And we hung up, and I got to kind of, I don't know, check that off the list. Got the kids put to bed. I eventually maybe went to sleep that night. And then woke up in the morning, and then had that feeling that maybe that was all just a dream. But when you wake up on your parents' couch, chances are life's not normal. I don't tend to wake up on my parents' couch very often, and so the realization that something really bad had happened certainly was alive and well. I knew that I had to tell the kids, and I'd asked my folks not to tell the kids the night before. I needed to talk to God, and I needed to talk to a couple pastors from church on that. And I thought about driving in this morning. Our department certainly learned something in the death of one of our officers not too long ago, is going to your pastors really quick, really early on. Death is one of those uncomfortable things that we don't have a lot of experience, we don't have a lot of practice on, but our pastors do because they unfortunately deal with it all too often. So I called God, talked to God quite a bit that morning, and also talked to a couple of the pastors at church. And I said, hey, how do I tell the kids? How do I tell them, that their mommy's not here? And they both kind of said the most resounding same thing. Hey, you're going to do just fine. You're going to be gentle. You're going to be honest. And above all else, you tell them exactly where their mommy is. Because both pastors at church knew Shelley's relationship with the Lord. And without a shadow of doubt, I and they knew where she was. So, leading up to the hardest thing I've had to do ever in my life is tell those two little guys up there, where mom's at. It just, it's one of those things that just doesn't seem right. It's not fair. It doesn't seem like it should be. After talking to the Lord and talking to the pastors, I loaded them back up in the pickup, and we headed home. And I told my folks I need to do this alone. It's a daddy's job to do this. And I was going to do that at home alone. And so we went home and unpacked the night clothes and everything else and got that put away. And I grabbed a little pink step stool that I keep to this day. Not that because I need it anymore, but it's just a reminder. And I set up that little pink step stool right there in the kitchen, right near the breakfast table. And I put Daisy on my right knee and Gage over on my left knee. And I told him, I asked Daisy, I said, Daisy, you remember about Bunky? And Bunky was Shelley's grandparents. And Daisy had been to his funeral not that long before Shelley died. And Daisy, she says, yeah, Dad. Bunky's in heaven with Jesus right now. And I went on to explain that, the kids knew something was up, but they didn't know what. And I went on to explain that Mommy was in an accident on her tractor the day before, and that she died. And that she's in heaven now with Bunky and Jesus. And 45 minutes later or so-ish, we stopped crying. And I think we stopped crying because we didn't have any more tears. They were all on the kitchen floor. They were done. I was done with crying for that day. And we headed back, after gave them lunch, we headed back down to the farm. And then people started coming over. And I was telling Cindy this morning, boy, that I wish I could have shortened up the first part of that. But I just needed you guys to get to this part. People started coming by the farm, and I left home separate. That was kind of my refuge at the time. And we kind of did all the meet and greets and everything else down at the farm. people started coming by, and I'll throw out a word that might prick somebody and put some people on edge, but the Christianese started. The Christian folklore, the Christian urban legends started. And at the time, I know that people's hearts are open and they want to reach out and they want to help. But so often in a time of grief and sorrow, words have the ability to hurt more than help. I was talking to Gunnar about what I was going to talk about today, and he said, the pastor's job in a time of loss, in a time of grief, in a time of death is so much more about presence than about words. And so the Christianese started, and Mike, you just got to trust God. God needed another angel. Mike, you just got to trust God. God needed more laughter in heaven, because Shelley was quite the jokester. God needed somebody to teach quilting classes. God needed somebody to organize some Scrabble games. Mike, you just got to trust God. God's in control. God's got this all worked out. This is best for you. But all this stuff, it points to the fact that, God caused this. And that's where it starts to kind of hurt. That's where those words have a tendency to help. And I know that everything was said in love, in caring. But the Christianese sayings start to hurt after a while, and they be counterproductive. And I decided, hey, if God caused this, then this is a little bit ouchy. This is a little bit hurtful. So I turned to Genesis, and I know Barry talked about Genesis, and right at the beginning of the book, it says, the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. Well, and you're like, hey, how does that apply to this? Well, the whole sovereignty concept of God causing this event in my life to happen, I have a loving God. I have a God that I can go to James 1:17, every good thing is from above. I've got a God that loves us. And certainly post-cross doesn't deal with this in the same manner. And in God's sovereignty, per this verse, we all know the rest of that story. We all know how that works. In God's sovereignty, He gave man and woman free will. He gave us the choice to choose right or wrong, good or evil, to follow God or walk away from God. He gave us that choice. And we know that God's not a bobblehead. He doesn't change. Well, I'll tell them this, but I mean this. When He told them, don't eat from that tree, we know what His will was. He didn't go back on His will. We know that His will is they shouldn't eat because everything was perfect right then. But then man decided, well, why not? What's the big deal? And we know that the sneaky snake who Daisy engaged loved the sneaky snake story. I think it just kind of sounds funny. But, we know how the sneaky snake gets involved. And we know the sneaky snake is alive and well on planet Earth, unfortunately. But God, in His sovereignty, He gave us free will. And He created man in His image. And I can't blame God for that in my life. I can't blame God for a mistake that was a human error. God didn't cause that. A couple weeks after Shelley died, a good friend dropped by the house, and his name's Grant, and he's a pastor of a real tiny church up in Temecula. And he said, Mike, you've got 2 paths ahead of you, and they're going to happen pretty soon. And Grant dropped off a print. His dad's a Christian artist, and he dropped off this print, and there's a little inscription down on the bottom to me. And he says, you've got 2 paths to choose. He says, you have a path that will lead to anger, bitterness, and resentment toward God, or you'll have a path that you'll follow, that you'll experience God's love, His grace, and His mercy, and your walk will be ever more close to Him. And I certainly feel that I've chose wisely on that. Another verse that's come up pretty frequently, and right now there's a couple people in the room who are cringing because they know where I'm going to go with this verse, Dave. This verse comes up often. We were playing theological tennis the other day with one of the guys at work whose son's going through a really, really, really tough time, and his son is absolutely not at fault for. And this verse gets brought up so often. I mean, often. And, Paul writes in here, and he says, we know God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. I don't view God as a little puppeteer up there with little strings attached to us, and we're just dancing around down here on earth. He gave us that free will, that we make decisions for ourselves. And this verse, it doesn't get applied to the entire world because the entire world doesn't love God. We know that, especially in the things that we see as cops from day to day. There's a lot of stuff that's not from God, that's from man's sinful nature. I think we certainly live in a sinful world. Barry talked about that, and we see that far too often, much more than the rest of the population. But 828 gets thrown around just like candy when something bad happens. Hey, it's God's plan, it's God's will, it's God's this. Where sometimes things happen out of God's will. And all we have to do is go back to Genesis 2. It wasn't God's will for Adam and Eve to take a bite, and he didn't interfere. He allowed man to follow his will. And again, I know that there's a few of you who are cringing at the theology behind this one right now, but we see it as cops all the time. Why did that 18-year-old throw down a six-pack of Bud Light and smash into that family and kill that whole family? Why did that happen? It certainly wasn't God's doing. God didn't cause that young man to break the law. Anyway, God doesn't give us a storm-free life, although it would be awesome. He never says that life will be free from storms. And I think we've all felt them. And if you haven't been in one, one's coming. Or there might be one right now. And if there's not right now, it might be in the near future. But in that, these things I've spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In a world that you have tribulation. But take courage, I have overcome the world. That tribulation, in the nearly inspired version, it's the words troubles. And I think we've all faced troubles from time to time. We know that. They're gonna happen. I probably don't even need to talk about that because we all know that story out of Matthew 7. And God talks about the wind and the rain and the floods that are going to come in each of our lives. And if our house is not planted firmly on him, great will be the fall. You know, in the times of comforting, timing seems like it's really important. And I think as police officers, as people involved in ministry, as people who have friends and have family and have relatives who are also going to go through storms in life, the timing winds up being so important. A couple verses up there, New Testament and Old Testament. Oops, there we go. Another couple New Testament, Old Testament verses. And I think as Christians right here in Ecclesiastes, it talks about a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. We all know that death is uncomfortable. None of us are trained, other than the pastors in the room, none of us are trained about what to say, how to say it. And yet as cops, we see it all the time. And everybody's somewhat uncomfortable about seeing somebody mourn and weep and sob. But God says there's a time for that, and there's a time and place for that. And when we attempt to take somebody from weeping to laughing or mourning to dancing, it just doesn't work. There's a stage, there's a time for that, and we have to allow that. Weep with those who are weeping, mourn with those who are mourning. If you guys can take away anything from my little message today, there is the right thing to say to somebody who's suffered a tragic loss. There is the right thing to say, because I think we can say the wrong things. And again, like I've said, sometimes words have the ability to hurt more than help. There is the right thing to say, and it's real simple. I love you, and I'm here. Or for you stoic guys that are afraid to say, I love you to another guy, I care about you, and I'm here. I care about you, and I'm here. The entire message of what you're feeling that needs to be conveyed to them is captured right there. And if you can't say that, a simple hug will convey the same words, the same message, and the same feeling that you have for that person. Gunnar and I talked about that the other day. It turns into a ministry of presence more than what's spoken. I'm going to wrap up here real quick and just read a couple things from a couple books that have helped me. I'm not very good with this thing. But the guy in the back of the room, he fixes pretty much all my mistakes, so thank you. This is a book by Jerry Sitzer, and I've given this book off a few times, and Jerry is a professor of theology at a college up north, and he lost his mom, his wife, and his daughter in a car accident due to a drunk driver. And it's a pretty amazing book. I'm just going to read a paragraph here. 8 years ago, I was in the throes of trying to raise 3 traumatized children. He still had 3 children that survived the accident, who had suffered a blow that no child should have to receive. I know that how I responded to the accident and functioned as a father would make all the difference in the world to them. They were my big project. As it turned out, they were also my redemption, though I did not know it at the time. Catherine and David are college students now. John is in high school. They have become extraordinary people, spirited, talented, serious, deeply Christian. I stand in awe of them. Words will never be able to express what they mean to me. As strange as it might sound, I wish that every man could experience what I have, though without the acute suffering. I only wish that 3 other members of my family were here to enjoy it too. Lastly, C.S. Lewis wrote a book after his wife of a very short amount of time died. C.S. Lewis is one of those writers that I can't read really fast. He goes deep. What he writes about is deep. In the sake of time, I'm not going to read that entire paragraph. But in the book, it's titled A Grief Observed, he says that grief is a price that we pay for love. And I hold that certainly to be true. You know, before Shelley died, I have to say that my life was blessed. I was born Christian, and a number of you will know what that means, being born Christian. You know, I can't remember not going to church. I can't not remember praying. I can't remember not going to vacation Bible school. I can't remember not having a nativity scene at Christmas. Mom and Dad would always talk about why we're putting the star on the top of the tree at Christmas. All that stuff that goes along with being a Christian. I can't remember not tithing except maybe for a short time in high school and college. Where other things are more important. But no, I can't remember not being a Christian, but Shelley's loss was certainly a awakening to me that life is so short, that life is precious, that I want my life to count for my kids, for Cindy, for the Lord. I don't want to be lukewarm. I want to have courage. I want to have faith, and I want to demonstrate that. So it matters. So when I stand in front of God, that it'll be well done, good and faithful one. With that, would you close in prayer, if that's okay? Father in heaven, we come before you today as your servants, as people who love you. To the name above all other names, Lord, we pray that people's hearts and minds can be touched by the folks who speak today, that they can go back out into their everyday lives on fire for you, in their communities and their families, a blessing to others, able to share your love for us to others. And Lord, we thank you so much for your grace and your mercy that you've placed upon our lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All God's people said, amen.